In February of 1944, as winter winds scraped across the factory fields of Buffalo, New York, test pilot Andrei Kachetkov sat in the cockpit of a brand-new P-63 King Cobra, listening to American engineers argue about whether the machine beneath him might kill him. The aircraft glistened with fresh paint, its serial number, 426-9261, still smelling of manufacturing oils. It was one of more than 2,000 fighters destined for the Soviet Union, part of a war effort America wasn't sure the Soviets could even win. At 31 years old, Kachetkov had already lived a lifetime in the sky. He had more than 2,000 hours behind a control stick, had flown everything from obsolete biplanes to prototype interceptors to captured German fighters that still smelled of enemy hands. The Soviet government sent him to America for a single purpose: to determine whether this new King Cobra was going to save Russian pilots or kill them the way its predecessor, the P-39 Airacobra, had already done. The King Cobra looked similar at first glance: mid-mounted engine behind the cockpit, tricycle landing gear, the automobile-style doors, and the same menacing 37mm cannon firing straight through the propeller hub. But it was bigger, heavier, and more powerful. Bell Aircraft had designed it to fix every flaw the P-39 had carried into battle. Better high-altitude performance, stronger structure, more speed, more firepower. The U.S. Army Air Forces had tested it and shrugged. It wasn't a Mustang. It wasn't even close. So they ordered more than 3,000 of them and sent most of them to the Soviet Union without ever intending to use them themselves. America built a fighter it didn't want, for a war it wouldn't fight, and placed its hopes on pilots who weren't even its own. But Andrei Kachetkov quickly discovered a truth the American engineers had either missed or ignored. The P-63 carried a hidden venom, a small flaw that could kill a pilot without warning. Its center of gravity was wrong. The engine sat behind the pilot, and the configuration placed tremendous mass at the rear. Under the wrong circumstances, especially during spins, that mass shifted in a way that made recovery impossible. Once the aircraft entered a flat spin, the nose refused to drop. The controls went dead. The P-63 simply rotated like a falling leaf, wide and flat and utterly indifferent to the pilot trapped inside. Soviet pilots had already died this way in the P-39. Not in combat, during training, during basic maneuvers, during moments that should have been routine. Experienced men, good weather, healthy aircraft, yet the result was always the same. A flat spin, a futile struggle, and a fatal impact. The P-39 had earned a reputation in the East as the flying coffin. Not because it performed poorly. In fact, Soviet pilots loved it in combat. They loved the heavy cannon, the rugged armor, the warm cockpit that didn't freeze their blood in -40-degree winters. They loved that the aircraft was deadly at low altitude, exactly where Soviet doctrine demanded they fight. What they feared, deeply, was the spin that could not be recovered. Every pilot knew someone who had vanished this way. Every flight carried the shadow of that risk. One wrong input, one moment of inattention, and the coffin would close. By late 1943, the Soviet Air Force had already received more than 4,000 P-39s. Though the United States insisted that they be used only against Japan, the Soviet Union was bleeding on the Western Front. They needed every fighter that could carry guns and fly straight. So they quietly deployed the Airacobras against the Luftwaffe, altering paperwork, reassigning serial numbers, and hoping the Americans wouldn't notice. German pilots noticed. They reported strange, American-looking fighters with tricycle landing gear and unfamiliar silhouettes. The truth was simple. The Soviets were fighting for survival, and rules meant nothing when the enemy was clawing at their borders. The problem wasn't pilot training. Soviet airmen knew how to recover from spins. Every Yak, every La 5, Every MiG-3 obeyed the same conventional rules: opposite rudder, forward stick, reduce power. But the Airacobra didn't behave like Soviet aircraft. Its engine arrangement, its weight distribution, everything about its dynamics was foreign. When Soviet pilots applied standard recovery techniques, the P-39 simply spun faster. When they fought harder, some airframes broke clean apart. If they tried to abandon the aircraft, the car-style doors jammed shut under centrifugal force. Some pilots died clawing at those doors while the ground rose to meet them. By the time Bell Aircraft sent technical documents for the new P-63 to Moscow at the end of 1943, the Soviets had every reason to be cautious. The King Cobra promised better performance in every category. The Soviets wanted that. They needed that. But they were no longer willing to trust promises. They insisted on sending their own experts to America, test pilot Andrei Kachetkov and engineer Fedor Suprun, to determine whether the aircraft was safe before accepting it by the hundreds. When they arrived at Bell's factory in Buffalo in February 1944, the Americans welcomed them politely but dismissed them quietly. To the engineers, these two visitors were foreigners who didn't understand American aircraft design. The P-63 had been tested extensively. It was ready. It was safe. If Soviet pilots had been crashing P-39s, well, perhaps the problem wasn't the airplane. Kachetkov began his assigned test flights, running through basic maneuvers. On the surface, everything looked fine. The King Cobra was fast, responsive, and powerful. But beneath that surface, he felt the same whisper that haunted the P-39. A subtle, unmistakable heaviness in the tail. He requested permission to test spins. The Americans hesitated. They insisted spin testing wasn't necessary. The aircraft was production-ready. But Kachetkov refused to accept an aircraft whose spin characteristics were unknown. Soviet pilots would not die in another machine with hidden teeth. He climbed the P-63 to 12,000 feet and entered a spin deliberately. At first, everything behaved as expected. Then he began the recovery, and nothing happened. Opposite rudder. Full forward stick. Neutral controls. Power changes. The aircraft spun flat, defiant, stubborn. He felt the airframe buckle, metal groaning under centrifugal stress. At 5,000 feet, he prepared to bail out. He reached for the door handle. Then, without warning, the nose finally dropped. Not because of anything he had done, but because the aircraft had lost enough altitude for the airflow to shift on its own. He brought the damaged aircraft back to Buffalo. The engineers inspected it and found the rear fuselage bent and buckled, evidence of stresses the airframe shouldn't have experienced. They were stunned. Their calculations had never predicted this. Yet the proof was right there, twisted into the metal of their brand-new fighter. Suprun studied the numbers, analyzed the design, and found the culprit. The center of gravity was too far aft under certain fuel and ammunition loads. No pilot, no matter how skilled, could fight physics when the aircraft's mass distribution betrayed him. The Americans reluctantly accepted that he was right. But redesigning the aircraft would be a catastrophe. They had already built thousands of P-63s. They needed the Soviets to accept them. And so the engineers offered a compromise: shift equipment forward, add ballast, adjust the balance just enough to make the aircraft safer without tearing it apart and starting again. Kachetkov tested the modified version. It wasn't perfect, but it was survivable. The aircraft responded. Spins could be recovered. It was good enough. And before he left Buffalo, he issued a simple directive: if a P-63 ever enters a flat spin, the pilot must bail out immediately. The Irving Parachute Company sent him a commendation for that advice. It would save lives. Over the next months, Soviet and American engineers worked side by side. They increased armor around the cockpit, added bomb hardpoints, extended range with new underwing mounts, shifted the cannon forward and expanded ammunition capacity. The King Cobra gradually transformed from an American idea into a Soviet-shaped machine. By mid-1944, it was effectively a joint creation, designed in the United States, rebuilt according to Soviet combat doctrine, and destined to fight under a Red Star. Getting the aircraft to the Soviet Union was its own odyssey. The ferry route from Buffalo to Great Falls, then across Canada through the Northwest staging route, finally up to Fairbanks and across the Bering Strait to Siberia, was one of the most dangerous aviation efforts of the entire war. Pilots battled -30-degree temperatures, sudden whiteouts, fuel shortages, engine failures, mountains hidden in clouds, and unforgiving seas. Many never returned. Their aircraft vanished into wilderness so vast that even today, wrecks are still being discovered. Yet hundreds of King Cobras made it across, flown by American ferry pilots to Alaska, and by Soviet combat veterans the rest of the way into the frozen East. The first P-63s reached Soviet hands by the summer of 1944. The official story was that they would be used only against Japan. The unofficial truth was more complicated. Soviet test pilots evaluated them against captured German Bf-109s and Fw-190s. The results were surprising. At high altitude, the German fighters outperformed the P-63. But at low altitude, the brutal knife fight arena where the Eastern Front battles were truly fought, the King Cobra excelled. Its roll rate was unmatched. It could reverse direction faster than almost anything in the sky. In tight turns at treetop height, it was a predator. By late 1944, multiple Soviet regiments were quietly converting to the P-63. Official paperwork listed P-39s or Soviet-built fighters, but German pilots began reporting encounters with larger, faster, more maneuverable mid-engine fighters they couldn't identify. The secrets of these ghost aircraft hid behind sealed Soviet documents, but they left fingerprints, mentions in German memoirs, wrecks recovered by flak batteries, and Soviet veterans who later spoke of King Cobras over Poland, East Prussia, and even Berlin. Whether the P-63 fought in Europe remains a mystery buried under decades of Soviet denial, but the scattered evidence suggests that at least some of them did. What is certain is that P-63s fought against Japan in August 1945. When the Soviet Union finally declared war on Japan and swept into Manchuria, King Cobras flew escort missions, ground attack sorties, and air-to-air combat. On August 15th, Lieutenant Miroznachenko shot down a Japanese Ki-43 in a low-altitude duel over the Sea of Japan, scoring the type's first confirmed victory. For the next week, P-63s carved their way across Manchuria and Korea, destroying aircraft on the ground, striking convoys, supporting ground troops, and proving themselves as the low-altitude fighters they had always been designed to be. When the war ended, the Soviets kept the P-63 in service for years. They used it as a transition trainer for new jet pilots learning the MiG-15. They converted some into two-seat trainers. They experimented with skis, rockets, drop tanks, and winter operations. By 1950, the last King Cobras were finally retired, but their legacy had already taken shape. Western intelligence had assigned them the NATO reporting name, Fred, unaware of the story behind their creation. Unaware of how Soviet pilots, Soviet engineers, American factories, and one determined test pilot in Buffalo had shaped the fate of the aircraft. Andrei Kachetkov never became famous. His work was buried behind bureaucratic walls and wartime secrets. But his insistence, his stubbornness, his willingness to risk his life in a spinning aircraft thousands of feet above the frozen New York countryside saved dozens, maybe hundreds, of Soviet pilots. The King Cobra became one of the most unusual fighters of the Second World War. Born in America, built for the Soviets, rejected by the U.S. Air Forces, perfected by Soviet engineers, flown in 2 different wars under 2 different doctrines, mysterious in Europe, proven in Asia, and nearly forgotten everywhere else. It was a fighter that traveled thousands of miles, crossed continents, crossed oceans, bore 2 nations' fingerprints, and survived a war in which it was never meant to be a hero. And it might never have survived at all if a quiet Soviet test pilot hadn't looked past the bright paint of a brand-new aircraft, sensed danger in the way it moved, and refused to trust numbers printed on a page. This is the story of the P-63 King Cobra, not the aircraft America built for itself, but the one Russia flew into the fire.